You are sitting right now, and I want you to notice something before you keep reading. Notice where your chin is. Notice where your shoulders are. Notice whether your rib cage is stacked over your hips or collapsed down toward your belly. Most people reading this are already curled forward, chin poking toward a screen, shoulders rounded, chest caved slightly inward. And here is the part almost nobody realizes: that position you are in right now is not just a posture problem. It is actively limiting how much air reaches your lungs, how much oxygen reaches your blood, and how much energy your brain has access to in this exact moment. This is not about looking confident or standing up straight for appearance. This is about a 1-minute physical reset that changes your breathing mechanics and your energy almost immediately. And once you understand why, you will never sit the same way again. Before we go further, if any of this is landing for you, go ahead and follow this channel, Smart Psychology, because we break down the real biology behind everyday habits like this one, not surface-level tips. And that context is going to make the rest of this genuinely useful to you. Let me start with the diaphragm, because almost nobody thinks about this muscle until something goes wrong with their breathing, but it is doing an enormous amount of work every single minute of your life. Your diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle sitting directly beneath your lungs, separating your chest cavity from your abdominal cavity, and every time you inhale, it contracts and flattens downward, pulling air into your lungs by creating negative pressure inside your chest. Every time you exhale, it relaxes and rises back into that dome shape, pushing air back out. This happens roughly 12 to 20 times a minute, thousands of times a day, and the range of motion that diaphragm needs to move through in order to work efficiently depends entirely on how much space it has to move into. When you slouch forward, when your chest caves and your lower ribs compress down toward your pelvis, you are physically shrinking the space your diaphragm has available to descend into. Think of it like trying to fully inflate a balloon inside a box that is slightly too small. The balloon can only expand part of the way before it hits the walls of the box. And that is exactly what is happening inside your torso when you slump. Your diaphragm hits a compressed rib cage and an abdomen with no room to expand outward. So instead of a full deep breath using the entire capacity of your lungs, you end up taking short, shallow breaths that barely use the upper portion of your chest. There is a specific piece of anatomy worth understanding here, called the zone of apposition, which is the section of your diaphragm that sits directly against the inner wall of your lower rib cage rather than against your lungs. And this zone is what allows your rib cage to expand outward like a bucket handle, lifting on both sides when you inhale properly. When your posture is upright and your rib cage is stacked correctly over your pelvis, that zone of apposition is large, giving your diaphragm strong mechanical leverage to pull your lower ribs outward and downward with each breath. When you slouch, that zone shrinks, your rib cage loses its leverage, and your diaphragm starts working less like a piston with a full range of motion, and more like a flattened muscle straining against a rib cage that has already collapsed inward. Physical therapists and researchers who study breathing mechanics have described this loss of zone of apposition as one of the most common, least discussed contributors to inefficient breathing patterns in people who spend long hours sitting, and it is almost never mentioned in typical posture advice, which tends to focus only on appearance rather than mechanical function. This is where posture and breathing stop being separate topics and become the same topic. Researchers who study respiratory mechanics have shown that slouched sitting postures measurably reduce something called forced vital capacity, which is simply the total amount of air you can forcefully exhale after a full inhale. In a compressed, rounded posture, that number drops, sometimes significantly, compared to an upright, open posture, because the mechanical space for lung expansion is reduced. Your lungs themselves do not shrink, they are the same size they were yesterday, but the space available for them to fill is smaller because your rib cage is not positioned to allow full expansion. And this matters far beyond just breathing comfort, because every breath you take is fundamentally a delivery system. It is how oxygen gets from the outside world into your bloodstream. And if each breath is shallower than it should be, less oxygen is entering that system with every single cycle. Now let us talk about what a compressed rib cage actually does to the rest of your spine and your nervous system, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Your thoracic spine, the middle portion of your back that your ribs attach to, is directly connected to a bundle of nerve pathways that influence your autonomic nervous system, the part of your nervous system that controls things you do not consciously think about, like heart rate, digestion, and how alert or relaxed you feel. When you slump forward for extended periods, you are placing sustained mechanical pressure on that thoracic region, and researchers who study posture and nervous system function have found associations between prolonged flexed postures and increased activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response system. Sitting hunched for hours is not neutral for your nervous system. It is a subtle, continuous signal that keeps your body slightly more primed for stress than it needs to be. Meanwhile, an open, upright posture, one where your chest is lifted and your shoulders are stacked over your hips, is associated with easier activation of the vagus nerve, the primary pathway of your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest side of your nervous system that calms your heart rate and supports recovery. There is a compounding effect here that most people never connect to their posture. A nervous system that spends more hours leaning towards sympathetic activation tends to run with slightly elevated baseline cortisol throughout the day, not the sharp morning spike that wakes you up, but a low, steady elevation that comes from your body interpreting hours of restricted breathing and physical compression as a mild, ongoing threat. Over weeks and months, that pattern is associated with poorer sleep quality, increased muscular tension, especially through the neck and upper shoulders, and a reduced ability to shift smoothly between focused effort and genuine rest. None of this happens because of one afternoon of bad posture. It happens because the body responds to repeated signals. And a chronically compressed ribcage sends that signal hundreds of times a day, every single day, for years, without you ever consciously noticing it happening. The vagus nerve itself runs from your brainstem down through your neck and chest, passing directly through the diaphragm on its way to your abdominal organs, and its function is deeply tied to how well your diaphragm is moving. Deep, full diaphragmatic breaths physically stimulate the vagus nerve through mechanical pressure changes in your chest and abdomen, and that stimulation is one of the fastest, most reliable ways to shift your nervous system out of a stressed state and into a calmer, more regulated one. Shallow chest breathing, the kind that happens automatically when you are slumped forward, does almost none of this. It keeps your breathing high and fast instead of deep and slow, and it keeps your nervous system leaning toward alertness and tension instead of calm and steady focus. This is why so many people feel a low-grade tension throughout the day that they cannot quite explain. Their breathing pattern has been shallow for hours, and their nervous system has been quietly responding to that pattern the entire time. If you want to actually feel this shift for yourself instead of just reading about it, stick with me through the next section, because I am about to walk you through exactly how to do the 1-minute reset. And I want you watching this channel, Smart Psychology, for more breakdowns like this one, because understanding your own body, this clearly changes how you move through your entire day. Now let us talk about energy, because this is the part most people care about most, and it connects directly to everything we just covered. Every cell in your body produces energy through a process that requires oxygen, using structures inside your cells called mitochondria, which take oxygen and nutrients and convert them into a usable energy molecule called ATP. This process is happening in trillions of cells right now, and it depends on a steady, adequate supply of oxygen reaching your bloodstream and then reaching your tissues. When your breathing is shallow because of compressed posture, less oxygen enters your blood with each breath, and over the course of hours, that adds up to a meaningfully lower oxygen supply feeding your mitochondria. Your brain is especially sensitive to this because your brain uses a disproportionately large share of the oxygen your body takes in relative to its size, and even small reductions in oxygen delivery can show up as the fog, the sluggishness, the low-grade tiredness that so many people feel by mid-afternoon and blame entirely on lack of sleep or too much work, when part of the actual cause has quietly been sitting hunched over a desk, breathing shallow chest breaths for hours at a time, breath after breath, without ever noticing the pattern forming. Think about the specific moment this usually shows up. Somewhere around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, sitting at a desk, shoulders rounded forward toward a keyboard, chin dropped toward a screen, and a wave of heaviness settles in that feels like it came out of nowhere. Most people reach for more caffeine in that moment, treating it as a fuel problem, when a large part of what is actually happening is mechanical, Hours of compressed breathing have slowly reduced the oxygen reaching working tissue, and the body is responding the way it responds to reduced oxygen availability, with fatigue, reduced focus, and a pull towards stimulants to override the feeling rather than address the mechanism producing it. This does not mean caffeine is the enemy. It simply means that treating a mechanical breathing problem with a chemical stimulant only masks the sensation temporarily. It does not restore the oxygen delivery itself, and that is exactly why the fatigue tends to return an hour or two later, sometimes more intensely than before. This is also connected to carbon dioxide regulation, which people rarely think about. Shallow breathing does not just reduce oxygen intake, it also disrupts how efficiently your body clears carbon dioxide, and proper carbon dioxide levels are actually necessary for oxygen to be released from your red blood cells into your tissues through something called the Bohr effect. If your breathing pattern is chronic shallow and irregular, this exchange becomes less efficient, and your cells end up with less accessible oxygen, even if your blood oxygen saturation reading looks technically normal on a fingertip monitor. This is part of why posture, breathing mechanics, and energy levels are so tightly linked. The problem is not always about how much oxygen you are breathing in, it is about how efficiently your body is able to use it, and that efficiency is shaped directly by your breathing mechanics, which are shaped directly by your posture. So here is the 1-minute posture reset, and I want you to actually do this with me rather than just reading through it, because the physical sensation is part of what makes this click. Start by sitting or standing with your feet flat on the ground, hip-width apart. Take a moment to notice your current posture without changing it yet. Now gently tuck your chin slightly, as if you are creating a small double chin. This movement lengthens the back of your neck and takes pressure off your cervical spine, and it is the opposite of the forward head position most people hold throughout the day. From there, roll your shoulders up toward your ears, then back and down, allowing your shoulder blades to settle down and slightly together. This opens your chest and takes your shoulders out of that rounded protective position they tend to collapse into during long periods of sitting. Next, place one hand on your chest and one hand on your lower belly, and take a slow breath in through your nose, focusing on expanding your lower hand outward first, then feeling your ribcage expand sideways, and only then feeling slight movement in your upper chest. This sequence trains your diaphragm to lead the breath instead of your upper chest muscles, compensating for a diaphragm that has no room to move. Exhale slowly and fully through your mouth or nose, letting your ribcage and belly fall back down. Repeat this breath 4 to 6 times, keeping your new posture, chin gently tucked, shoulders stacked over your hips, chest lifted without arching your lower back excessively. While you are breathing, add one more component, a gentle thoracic extension. With your hands still resting on your chest and belly, or gently interlaced behind your lower back, allow your upper back to arch slightly, lifting your breastbone toward the ceiling. This counteracts the forward rounding that builds up from hours of screen time, and it physically creates more room in your ribcage for your lungs and diaphragm to expand into. Hold that lifted position gently for a few seconds at a time, breathing through it rather than holding your breath, and repeat that lift 3 or 4 times over the course of your minute. The entire sequence, chin tuck, shoulder roll, ribcage expanding breath, gentle thoracic lift, repeated for about a minute, is short enough to do at your desk, in your car before you walk into a meeting, or standing in a kitchen waiting for coffee to brew, and that accessibility is exactly the point. Because the benefit comes from consistency across the day, not from doing it once, and considering the problem solved. What happens in your body during that 1 minute is measurable and immediate. Your intercostal muscles, the muscles between your ribs, get activated in a way they were not being activated during shallow slumped breathing. Your ribcage physically expands to a greater degree, your diaphragm descends further with each breath, and your lung volume for that breath increases compared to the shallow breathing pattern you were in moments before. Researchers who study breathing interventions have consistently found that even brief periods of slow, diaphragmatic breathing produce measurable shifts toward parasympathetic activation, including reductions in heart rate and increases in heart rate variability, which is a marker associated with a nervous system that is regulated and resilient rather than chronically stressed. This is not a slow, gradual improvement that takes weeks to notice. This is something your body responds to within the very minute you are doing it, because the mechanical and neurological pathways involved respond quickly to changes in breathing depth and posture. There is also a cognitive piece worth mentioning here, because posture and breathing do not just affect how your body feels, they influence how your brain performs in the minutes immediately afterward. Increased oxygen delivery combined with a calmer, more parasympathetically balanced nervous system creates better conditions for sustained attention and clearer thinking. This is part of why people often report feeling noticeably more alert and less foggy after doing something as simple as sitting up, opening their chest, and taking several full diaphragmatic breaths. It is not a placebo effect. It is a direct physiological consequence of more oxygen-reaching tissue that was previously getting slightly less, combined with a nervous system shifting out of a mild stress state and into a calmer, more focused one. The reason this matters so much in daily life is because most people are not dealing with one dramatic slump. They are dealing with hundreds of small collapsed moments throughout the day, reaching for a phone, leaning into a laptop, driving with shoulders rounded forward, and each of those moments compounds slightly, keeping breathing shallow and posture compressed for the majority of waking hours. The 1-minute reset is not meant to be a single fix you do once in the morning and forget about. It is meant to be something you return to every hour or two, a short physical checkpoint that interrupts the slow accumulation of compressed breathing and resets your rib cage, your diaphragm, and your nervous system back toward an open, efficient state. Over the course of a full day, that repeated resetting adds up to meaningfully more oxygen delivered, meaningfully less accumulated tension in your thoracic spine, and a nervous system that spends more of its time in a calm, regulated state instead of a low-grade stressed one. There are a few common mistakes worth mentioning, because they quietly undermine this reset for a lot of people who try it once and give up. The first is arching too aggressively during the thoracic extension, pushing the lower back into an exaggerated curve instead of lifting from the mid-back, which just trades one compensation pattern for another, instead of actually creating space for the diaphragm. The second is holding the breath at the top of the inhale instead of breathing continuously through the sequence, which keeps the nervous system slightly activated rather than allowing the calming effect of a full exhale to happen. The third, and probably the most common, is doing the reset once in the morning and assuming the benefit lasts the rest of the day, when in reality the compression builds back up within 20 or 30 minutes of returning to a slumped position at a screen. The people who notice the biggest shift in energy are almost always the ones who treat this as a repeated checkpoint rather than a one-time fix, setting a reminder every hour or two, standing up between meetings, or simply noticing the moment their chin starts drifting forward and resetting right then, instead of waiting until the end of the day. It is also worth comparing this to some of the more expensive or complicated solutions people reach for first: standing desks, ergonomic chairs, posture-correcting braces, all of which can genuinely help, but none of which solve the underlying issue on their own, if the person using them is not also training the breathing pattern itself. A standing desk can still be used with a collapsed rib cage and shallow chest breathing, and a posture brace can pull your shoulders back without teaching your diaphragm to actually use the space that creates. The 1-minute reset works directly on the mechanism, rib cage position and breathing depth, rather than only on the visual appearance of good posture, which is exactly why it produces a noticeable shift in how alert and clear-headed you feel within the same minute you do it, not days or weeks later. If you have made it this far, you already understand something most people never think about, that the connection between how you sit and how much energy you have is not vague or motivational. It is mechanical, it is measurable, and it is something you have direct control over in any given minute of your day. You do not need new equipment, you do not need to change your entire daily routine, and you do not need weeks of consistency before you feel anything. The shift in how deep your breath feels and how clear your head feels can happen inside the same 60 seconds you spend doing the reset, and that immediate feedback is exactly what makes it worth returning to again and again throughout your day, rather than treating it as one more habit you intend to build someday. Try the 1-minute reset right now if you have not already. Notice the difference in how deep your next breath feels compared to the breath you took before reading this. And if you found this useful, Follow Smart Psychology for more breakdowns that connect the biology of your body to how you actually feel and function every day. Because understanding the mechanism behind a habit is what makes that habit actually stick. And your posture, your breathing, and your energy for the rest of today start with the very next breath you choose to take. One deliberate, full, unhurried breath, taken right now, before you close this and move on with whatever comes next.